actual schemes and registered and have the NOC to construct, and the rest of them are all bogus. So जो नज़र आता है, it's a very large Ponzi scheme, you know, कि भाई आपने और है भी क्या housing schemes 3 मरला 5 मरला और 10 मरला की गेम है कि आपने जितने बेचना है बेचें, इससे बेचने तो पूरे मुल्क को भी आप एक तरीके से आप 3-5 मरला के प्लॉट्स में डिवाइड करके बेच दें तो बड़े पैसे बने. So that is the mantra of all the real estate deals. There is no end game in sight. 99% of them are unrealized और बनता कुछ भी नहीं है. It's just the game of plots. तो यहाँ पर हम सवाल उठाते हैं कि plots versus construction. कि what do we mean by that? So Ateeq Ahmed Saab, he's an urban planner and architect and runs OCO, and he has, you know, very interesting credentials. I will ask Ateeq to join us in this conversation right now. Ateeq?
Thank you, Isbah. And so basically, as an urban designer, you know, चंद सवाल उठ रहे हैं कि सबसे पहले अगर हम, you know, पाकिस्तान का housing shortfall देखें, तो South Asia में we have one of the largest housing shortfalls after Afghanistan, which is a war-torn country since the last however many decades. So अब यहाँ पे जो, you know, which doesn't make sense because you go down a road, जितने भी आपको इश्तिहार नजर आएंगे, आप देखेंगे housing scheme after housing scheme. But there are so many people, even in this room, who probably cannot find adequate housing at the right price. So हो यही रहा है कि जैसे आपने बोला कि it's like a Ponzi scheme, but I mean, in the sense it does seem to be just catering to very few sort of sections of the market where you are guaranteed to make a profit and get, you know, more than just your return on investment. So if we look at this presentation, we must also talk about the impact of all of this growth and where is this actually going. Lahore used to be a tiny city, something like about 12 miles wide, and keep going. Thank you. But the population of both the country and the city have been rising at an insane speed. Between 1990 and 2019, the population of Lahore rose by 109%. Now, all of this then, of course, impacts the built environment, because we forget that the built environment is actually also part of a larger environment, what we might actually call our habitat. Next, please. So, I'm sorry for the lack of legibility, but आगे चलिए please. So, अगर जी इस slide के अंदर हम देखें तो you'll notice that in this image over here, this is the loss of agricultural land that we've actually seen in the last 2 decades. The black over there is actually showing how the footprint of the city, the built environment of the city has actually grown over time. Next. Sorry, we can't see that slide again, but basically that's showing us densification. ये रात का एक व्यू है जिसके अंदर हमें actually we see the lights illuminating the terrain, and जो हम लोग देख रहे हैं वो ये देख रहे हैं कि जो हमारे बड़े शहर थे वो हद से ज़्यादा डेंस हुए चले जा रहे हैं, और जो निजी शहर थे उनके जो कनेक्टिंग रोड्स हैं गोइंग टूवर्ड्स द बिग सिटीज़, वो सारे के सारे कॉलोनाइज हो रहे हैं हाउसिंग स्कीम्स के साथ. और ये चीज़ हमें ज़रूर ख्याल रखना चाहिए कि यहीं से हमारा सारा गल्ला आता था, यानी कि दिस वाज आवर फूड सिक्योरिटी, और यही सब सारे का सारा हमारे जी एक एनवायरमेंटल बैलेंस भी मेंटेन कर रहा था. कार्बन सिंक, इफ़ यू गो टू इस्लामाबाद आप ऑटोमेटिकली नोटिस करेंगे कि सड़क से हट के ग्रीन बेल्ट पे टेम्परेचर कितना एकदम बदल जाता है. So, we can't deny that actually, just because ज़मीन, पे घास लगा हुआ है, उसकी कोई इकोनॉमिक वैल्यू नहीं है, एक्चुअली उसका एक बहुत एक लार्जर स्केल पे एक इम्पैक्ट है। नेक्स्ट प्लीज। कराची के जी अंदर भी हम देख रहे हैं कि अब ये दिस यूज्ड टू बी पारसी कॉलोनी बट नाउ दिस इज ऑल स्लम्स। आगे जाइए जी। ये अगेन जी इस्लामाबाद विच इज़ आर दारुल खलीफा, अब यहाँ पे भी सेंटोरस हमें वहाँ पीछे नज़र आ रहे हैं जी, और आगे सारे ये जी ब्लॉक के बेसिक स्लम्स जो कि अब बन रहे हैं। आगे जाइए जी। दिस इज़ 19th सेंचुरी व्यू ऑफ शालीमार। इसके पूरे बाग के एरिया एक ज़माने में देयर वर फील्ड्स एंड ऑर्चर्ड्स एंड ओपन लैंड। इफ़ वी नाउ सी द सिचुएशन नेक्स्ट, ये सारे का सारा जी has all been built up. So the impacts that we as a people, as a population are having on our habitat is on so many levels that it's even affecting our actual heritage assets. It is compromising their environmental integrity. आगे जाइए। ज़ाहिरी बात है जी पॉपुलेशन बढ़ रही है, सो गाड़ियाँ बढ़ रही हैं, गाड़ियाँ बढ़ रही हैं नेक्स्ट, तो उसके ऊपर जी इन्वायरमेंटल इम्पैक्ट हो रहा है। दिस इज शोइंग यू द डिमिनिशमेंट ऑफ द स्नो कवर इन जस्ट 2 decades, एंड दिस इज बेसिकली इन आवर नॉर्दर्न एरिया। आगे जाइए जी। अब अताबाद लेक डिजास्टर विच वाज बेसिकली brought about by again climate change. आगे आप देखिएगा तो लाहौर Lakshmi Chowk gets flooded. I've actually seen boats over there. I'm sure you will experience it too. आगे देखिए जी, so Peshawar, आगे जाइए तो Nौshera and Swat, Chitral, keep going. And of course, our 5th season in Lahore. So all this growth is of course impacting our health, it's impacting our lives. We actually are just looking at it from the aspect, okay, let's sell land, let's sell a plot, exactly, let's make a buck. But
yeah, so basically now we are looking at by the year 2025 that 50% of your population will be heading towards urban centers for their housing. So how do we mitigate all of this, and what are the issues, and how do we deal with it? We're talking about sprawl versus density as well. So what, in your opinion, should be the direction of all of this?
I think we need to look at, for example, what Mumtaz is doing with her practice.
So let's talk.
Where you're actually taking former residential plots which had, say, maybe an average family size of 7.5, and now you're actually building these, but I'll let you sort of tell us more.
So basically now we're talking about plot versus construction. I mean, like historically plots are seen as a safe haven of investment, but it doesn't solve your housing problem. And I've heard a lot of developers say, make statements like, gee, plots is the real business, ye to jo banate hain wo malba hi hai. Okay? So I mean, that sort of kind of denies an entire history of habitat and architecture, and you are the developer. Tell me what your thoughts are on construction and the issues that you face, and how to mitigate those issues, and what is your general idea in terms of how do we progress further with building our cities?
I think we do have a fairly good zoning right now in Lahore to go high-rise. However, to go high-rise is a much bigger... Can you hear me? आ रही है बस? Can you hear? All right. Okay. I mean, I'm not so disturbed by the... I mean, obviously we can tweak all these bylaws and all that to a much finer detail. However, the high-rises are allowed and for residential use, but where I find the problems are, like, you also have high-rise for office building in the same zone as you have for residential. And sometimes it gets hard to sort of work the two projects together or whatever, put put them in the same vicinity, which is probably what is discouraging some of the, we're discussing residential, I presume, right? At the moment, we're only talking about residential density,
kind of
the 5 marla, right, plots and all that. That's not commercial density. We're basically discussing housing. So for that, I think the bylaws are there, everything is there, but it's very expensive to go up. The one thing we don't really realize, the 5 marla and the 3 marla is a much cheaper solution to build. However, the fact all these housing schemes are all sitting around unoccupied is what's, to me, more disturbing. The 3 and 5 marla exists in Brooklyn. You go to New York, West Village, it has the 5 marla house. It's just a different type of person living in there. So I think having a canal is definitely not a good idea. Having 3 and 5 marla, to me, is still a relatively dense population, as we were discussing.
I think it's interesting what you're suggesting, because certainly we don't necessarily plot or use the available space very effectively. We did this exercise at Rocco where we looked at cavalry grounds. So we took the existing area, counted all the houses, and then on the existing space, replanned the entire space. And we managed to get more people in there because it was like a 5 marla house. It was like a 15-foot by 40-foot kind of dimension. And it was very, very efficient. And then we, like you were saying about the bylaws, so I don't understand our bylaws because they favor the car so much. When you're working on a 5 marla house, how can you give so much space away for the, to the car?
100%, and not only that, my thing is also not the planning is really pretty bizarre in some of these schemes.
So shouldn't the developer be giving like common parking?
Build. My problem right now is even worse. They're not building. We are just taking lands, and they are, DHA has something like, I think, 5,000 plots from phase 1 to 5. 6 has like something like 12,000 plots. Only 30% are occupied. But we have leveled the roads, we've built the infrastructure, but the housing shortfall remains because the plots are still kept empty. I mean, knowing that our average age is 22, we have a huge young population that's going to require housing, families, kids. How are we allowing these developers not to build?
But look at the prices of the houses that are available. I mean, a 5 marla is, something like what, 75 lakhs?
Yeah, something like that.
So how do young people then actually find a house?
Especially without financing.
So that's an interesting point.
Right.
I was trying to bring some bankers on board and to talk about mortgaging facilities given to the various housing schemes. So there was a very interesting feedback. And the answers were basically that one of the biggest factors in high pricing rates and complex documentation and the KIBO rates is one of the reasons why housing finance becomes a little difficult. And there is no special facility is available for low income. Last scheme was launched by the government was MPMG, LCH Government Subsidized Housing Scheme, which was again terminated in June 2022. So again, the lack of continuity in government policy is also a big issue. And banks, however, are offering off-plan finance and project plan financing for high-rise private schemes. Are you familiar with this?
A little bit.
Okay. Now, the government and the State Bank of Pakistan have to play a vital role to bring about housing mortgages into mainstream. They have taken some initiatives like the Roshan Apna Ghar and low-cost housing, etc. So, I mean, again, like I said, it has to be like an integral policy of the government to promote housing and to offer facilities to the low-income sector of our society, and which is not at all, I mean, we are somehow a cash society. And a cash society means कि जी plot खरीदो, रखो, 2 साल में appreciate हो जाएगा. And there's a big hustle going on, okay? But it started with DHA back in the 1980s, and it has, then you've seen the advent of the bigger giants like Behria, which have kind of,
I think the very visible success of Behria has catalyzed LDA, for example, into completely chasing a different model of growth. They want to be the next Behria as well, which means that they
I think everybody wants to be the next Behria or the DHA. I mean, I want to be Behria town, I mean, I just, it's like mind-boggling what they're trying to do.
But, that's a private enterprise. LDA is not. So now, should LDA be also catering to just that 12% of the population that can afford to buy a house?
So basically there's a big disconnect, okay, from the perception of housing and actual housing. Nobody is actually talking about housing. I remember the first housing scheme that was initiated by Mr. Nawaz Sharif in the 1990s, which was the Prime Minister's housing scheme. It was a mad race. They were never finished. And half of them were kind of,
the government changed, then policies changed.
How do you bring about the effectiveness of policy and continuity?
लेकिन एक question जो हम I think we haven't really addressed it fully is the question is we are discussing plots versus construction to some extent. How are we allowing plots unless they are constructed? Because that is very damaging to the planet or the country we are on. When you just cut down the trees, you cut down the land, and you leave it vacant for 20. Even Defense 6 started, I remember, something like 2000. Yeah, it's 23 years later. It's not even 50% back. 2005 was Defense 7. 2000, I think, what? 7 or 8.
And for years,
it's been 20 years. It's just empty 9.
On a satellite image, you saw these just dust plains. Because they had been plotted, they were fields.
This is the problem, that they're allowed to be plotted and lying there. Now there's no taxation. Why? Like in the West, for example, to keep a plot empty, you just can't afford to, because they'll dump so much taxation on you that you won't be able to. So nobody would invest in real estate. They will invest in the house they need to live in, which actually triggers a construction boom where you will find more jobs. We have something like a 2.5% construction economy in Pakistan versus China, which is I think a 30% or something ridiculous like that. And that's partly why we're saying they can't afford, but everybody can go and put a room, 2 rooms, probably up if they could afford cheaper land. But we are just cutting them down and forcing people to invest in them like stocks versus actually an abode, a dwelling of some kind. And that's where I think construction is a must. And how do we bring it in?
So when we're talking about construction, there are two, it's kind of two-pronged. Are we talking about urban regeneration of our existing cities, or we're talking about new
economic,
urban centers?
Sort of
so
trigger.
I mean, do we have to balance the two out? And do we conserve our existing cities and make them more vertical? I mean, how do you think one should approach this?
Certain parts of our cities need to be preserved. Like, if we're talking about Manhattan, for example, even, there are parts of it that are very low rise, and then there are parts of it that are just, tallest buildings in the world.
Exactly.
So if you look at creating a kind of balance where, sure, maybe we can get public housing that is vertical, but again, not so huge like Hong Kong style, because then the human scale is lost. And that is extremely important, because sure, we want to have the construction industry trigger the economy, but what sort of environments are we making? What sort of habitat do we want to live in? That's also a question.
Yeah.
Now, I do believe we should have vertical, sort of downtowns that are vertical, and around it, like we're talking about 5 Malla, 2 Malla, but we could also do some satellite towns, which we haven't focused on at all. With this new thing, I mean, instead of putting a train service, which could be electric, whatever, goes 30 miles outside, the people can come and commute, and it could be cheaper land for them to be able to reside.
Absolutely.
And that's something we haven't been doing. It's gotten very expensive around Lahore. And it was bound to, because there's so many schemes. If the scheme, nobody would build a scheme if they had to build a house on it. That's actually something nobody really realizes. Developers are not interested in building a 5 Malla house. They're interested in making the plotting. Yeah. And that's an easy one. The minute they're forced to build a house, they won't have so much
and
nonsense.
And the quality
around.
of what they build is so bad. If you look at Defense Raya, for example, all those villas look so damp.
Yeah.
Yes, that's essentially true. So when we're talking about like the urban regeneration, what context and what are other, how do we perceive it, and what is the way forward with it?
I think we need to create mixed-use environments. Mall Road, for example, you had people living upstairs in apartments, you had offices, you had shops, you had schools, you had so many services you could access within a 10-minute walk. A lot of people nowadays are talking about the 15-minute city. And everyone is talking about how actually Barcelona is the model to follow, because everything is within 15 minutes of walk time. And London, for example, has triggered urban revitalization by creating transport and mobility as a prime sort of trigger. London has the world's highest public transport accessibility levels, and if you see how they've structured their entire public transit system, the growth and the system kind of follow the same trajectory.
Okay, now when we talk about what kind of activities should like a model society encompass. Okay, yeah, over here we have a very standardized formula that we seem to follow, which is dictated by the various governing agencies, let's say the CDA or the LDA.
Our formula is stuck in the 1930s.
Exactly. So how do we update that? How do we bring about awareness is what I want to know.
Livability. We need to understand that we're all human beings. We want to socialize. We want to find moments of calm and, reprieve in an urban environment. We don't want to necessarily waste so many thousands of rupees on petrol. We should be able to open a window when the weather is good.
Yeah.
I mean, so how come all these simple luxuries in life are just disappearing and diminishing the quality of life? Like in our urban centers, can you imagine sleeping with the window open on Firozpur Road?
No, that's not happening at any given time. So, so again, we're also talking about green infrastructure. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Green infrastructure is the way forward.
Is the way forward. If we're talking about pedestrians, we're talking about the climate.
Less reliance on cars.
Less reliance and that seems to be like the biggest problem that we have, that even for a 5 Marla plot, you're going to kind of, make an allowance for 2 cars or maybe 1 car, which does not make sense. So pedestrianization.
If you look at the distances in defense, phase 6, they're impossible. It's like you're living in Dubai.
Exactly.
But if you look at the distances in Gulberg, they're like all the big markets, the small markets, they're a few kilometers away. And that's how it was designed. So you could walk, you could cycle.
So basically, from what I'm gathering is that there has to be a lot of integration from all walks of life, that you have to have the architects, the thinkers, the political will to implement these policies, and better people who are formulating the laws and the bylaws of this country.
My question is, what image of a city do we have in our heads?
Exactly.
Is it a city of overpasses and underpasses with glass towers and, shiny, fancy supercars? Or, okay, if we want that image, do we have the resources to make it reality?
What is very funny is that Gwadar, I remember going to Gwadar expecting some, like magic formula, Dubai-esque kind of a landscape. And there was this poor gentleman who actually bought a piece of land, and he came to Gwadar thinking there are going to be high-rises, it's going to be like Dubai. And he was actually shocked So it's projection versus reality of these housing schemes as well. You show images of skyscrapers and fabulous things, and on-ground reality is nothing more than a little dusty 3 marla and 5 marla plot.
What is a smart city? I asked
Oh no,
you.
I mean you have to
drive
outside. There's nothing smart about it. Okay, you drive outside of Islamabad, go all the way to Chakri, and you see this mushrooming blue city, smart city, God knows what city, middle of nowhere. And what are they selling? And Blue City has these horrendous Chinese pagodas, and I believe it was the biggest Ponzi scheme of its own time, because the guy did not even own the land and he pawned it off. He sold it to the expats who are unsuspecting expats. Made a ton load of money, has got more land and is floating more plots along the way.
Islamabad is not going to Fateh Jang, have you heard?
Yes, Fateh Jang is old. You have to look at Chakri, you have to look at, the poor, terrain of the entire country. You go 30 kilometers outside of Islamabad on the way to Sawat, and you see housing societies there. How do we protect ourselves from these,
That's where policy comes in. That's where the,
So PQ, we have you here. I'm going to, kind of drag you out and ask you, since you are, one of the more, one of the pioneering town planners of our country and the urban planners. So I want your mindset. I know you're not part of this panel, but what the hell, since we are here.
Okay. I'll be just getting me involved.
Yeah.
Look, the core issue. There's the core issue. Sorry. The whole thing. I think the subject under discussion was plots versus construction.
Yeah.
So we can stay on that focus for a few minutes. And the question is that why is this not happening? And you have all this plotting going on one side, and there's really no construction of multi-story buildings. Nobody's really gone into detail. Always remember, the devil is in the detail. The detail is as follows, perhaps. We don't have a regulatory framework for putting up multi-story buildings in terms of its ownership. We lack that in Punjab. I'm making a statement which very few people actually would say, "Ye kis tarah ho sakta hai?" वो इस तरह सकता है कि there is none. If you have a multi-story building and you own flat number 4 on the 7th floor, there is no legal recourse that you actually have in terms of your ownership. There is no concept of an A lease on the land and B lease on the apartment building. Those people who are actually building, like Mumtaz and her whole team is doing, they're doing a great job, but unfortunately we don't have a legal recourse on it. And the first time that it was recognized was that when there was an earthquake that took place in Islamabad, and you saw this apartment building fall and collapse, and the residents died, many people died. But there was a lack. If somebody had an apartment on the 7th floor, and certainly that whole building had, what right did they have on that parcel of land? And it was the Supreme Court decision which actually took a decision or took a fundamental position that there has to be a certain threshold of ownership.
No, actually, that has happened already. All our buildings, the common areas belong to a trust, and in that they own every apartment owns 1% or 2% of the plot and the common area, and that should be a law. It's not a law, but it should be a law.
Now that's the point that I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, it should be a law that everybody has to give those away to a trust.
Individual developers have had individual roles to play in this.
Right.
In your particular case, you've transformed it into a trust. Others retain the ownership. There's somebody else who does that. So there's something known in perpetuity. When you buy a building, it's there for 10, 20, 30 years. So one of the key elements is that we need to put together a condominium law in Punjab, specifically in Punjab, to ensure that you have multi-story buildings. So that's something that I've been talking about, raising at different forums, that this is one of the fundamentals to promote construction. Number 2, the taxation regime is so outrageous. So you find very few people who own a block of buildings, an individual. You'll only find them trusts who own buildings. State life insurance trust building ek bani hui hai. You can't find an XYZ person who owns a building other than a bank. वो क्यों है? Because the rates of property tax and other taxation goes up to approximately 80%, which is a non-incentive to build. So we need to go to the core policy issues. Two main policies. One is a taxation regime on the rental portfolio. The second one is dealing with the legal ownership. Now, you can turn around and say, okay, why is this happening in Karachi? In Karachi, there is a mechanism under the same building control ordinance where you have a multi-story building and you have a concept of an A lease and a B lease. So there are the rights of the individual who owns a flat or an apartment are protected by law, whereas in Punjab it is not. So that's two basically. Therefore, now in the event that there is a dispute and you land up in the courts, you have no way to resolve the problem. So the thrust for individuals to buy land, it can be a 2-marla, 3-marla or a 5-marla, because उसकी एक consistent registry होती है. उस registry के तहत, he has access to that parcel, which is then potentially mortgageable. It can be transferred. So we need to fix these core issues first, and they are the primary reason why these.
So what is the impediment to fixing these laws? I mean, if they are so apparent and...
So apparent. Now, under different formats, under different forums, we've been making this pitch. And the pitch is, let's get the LDA and let's get the Punjab legislative system to work out a condominium law, on which now there is a draft law which has already been prepared, and that is currently in circulation. And it's people like you and these forums like where we are all sitting, where we need to push this forward. Number one. Number two, the rental portfolio is so outrageously taxed that it is a disincentive for anybody to build a multi-story building and put it on rent.
I think there's another reason why the rental portfolio...
Now we managed to do this on the sales tax in the provincial government. I tried to explain to the finance people that in order to promote this industry and in order to have multi-story buildings, we need to really get going and correct one or two of these issues. Third is, we have huge problems in what we refer to the intensity of land use. Now, for example, in defense, it's a classic example that you buy a plot of land, say a 1 canal plot of land, say 6, 7, and you give it a price. And that price is like 3 crore rupees, say, per canal. What you're allowed to build on it is 1.4 FAR on that land, which means you're allowed to build, say, 5,800 square feet or whatever. Now, the cost of land is 3 crores, and what you're actually building on top is approximately 3 crores as well. It depends on how you sort of cost it out. So the asset value is something like 6. 50% is land cost, and say 50% is construction cost. Now, any policy maker anywhere in the world, if you were in China and you had this policy, they'll take the policy maker out and shoot him, because we are downgrading the asset. In other words, intensity of land, which is finite. It is just limited. We can't go across all the way to India. It is finite. We need to build as much on that parcel of land as possible. So our FARs, which are floor area ratios, have to be increased. We need to increase the intensity of land use. So now that again is a huge problem. Now we managed to convince the LDA that all right, this is what we need to do, and they have now increased the FAR ratios in many areas of Lahore. But in other areas of Lahore, for example, defense doesn't exist. And incidentally, DHA controls and the cantonment controls something like 25% of the city's geographic area.
I actually Googled to see how many military establishments have housing schemes across the world. None, except for Pakistan.
That is true.
That is the biggest problem that this country has, unfortunately. And trying to bring about like a serious policy and having a serious dialogue is again, something which is
If you just look at DHA alone, right?
Yeah.
DHA supposedly exists where the cantonment is. DHA also exists in the south of Lahore.
Of course.
It also exists on EME any society DHA whatever. The Ranger Society there are pockets of DHA spread all over the city. And if you start looking at that and the area that is encompassed by the cantonment, and depends on what you really determine as Lahore, it ranges anywhere between 18 to 25% depending on what you limit as the boundary.
DHA is a huge, huge area everywhere, and I mean they've taken about 9,000 hectares of mango orchards from Multan, 15,000 hectares have been created
what is happening
from
is
the
the
sea.
floor area ratio.
But coming back to the floor area ratio, now Gulberg showed the ratios have been increased. Where's the parking? Where is the actual sort of public sort of, concern in all of this? Because I'll get my floor area ratio increased. Awesome. I get more money. I can, get my assets sort of, valued higher. But how valuable is my asset if the street outside is
Actually, on this one, apartments don't require too much cars. Like I have an office, it's on ground floor, because I was thinking of getting it in a building, but I know I have 10 or 15 cars at any given time. My apartment has 1 car, 2 cars maximum, depending on size of an apartment. So apartments never really overflow.
That is very true.
With
It's
apartments.
the commercial
When you
buildings
go,
that do.
like even in New York, your commercial never goes up more than 2 stories. Here somehow they keep giving commercial high-rise. I haven't seen that in New York. Usually you'll have 1 floor that can go commercial because they know the traffic that it brings
But
in.
Mumtaz, the model that seems to be preferred right now is the mixed-use model where there's a mall, there are offices and
Well,
flats.
that's a problem because offices go to office parks outside. Technically at this point, to be building offices in a driving city is not
there's
so
a
easy.
development coming up on next
For-
to Firdaus
how
Market.
far? Yeah, I know. How far down are we going to go?
CBD you're talking about.
Well, the CBD is one thing where the LTA has actually relaxed the parking rules.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
But for apartment, it's fine. I think I was looking, it's
But
1200 per on
it's
behind us.
1600
They've taken
for-
it back to 12 just recently, which was
Okay.
good.
So we
So I
have
was happier
more-
with that.
Okay.
And they've done
but it
that.
was at 1,000 before that.
Yeah, but 12 is also okay because they, you know what they do? They
I
take
think-
common areas
I think
also
what we
in
need to
it.
really focus on
Yeah, I don't think that's an issue.
the subject under discussion. And the subject under discussion really is construction versus these plots. And get to the core issue, why is there not enough construction taking place? And why are we going to this plot concept? So we can manage to correct some of the anomalies in our policy around floor area ratios, legislation around ownership on the path of correction.
The ownership issue is very intense.
Well, I think what we have done is everybody owns part of the property as well. So if it's a 6-canal plot, you own your 50 apartments, you own 1/50th of the plot as well. God forbid there's an earthquake, there's a damage, you want to go high-rise tomorrow, 50 years from now, we don't know what happens. So you not only have the trust, you're also an owner of the plot. So that's a very important
That's
thing.
now in your specific case, okay?
Right, that should be a
Whereas
law.
I can give you innumerable examples where the owner of an apartment really has no jurisdiction on the corridor. Okay?
That's true.
So, in terms of the rights of the owners, so if you're going to be making what we refer to as creating a third-party interest, meaning thereby that you're selling something to a third party, and you need to ensure that their rights of ownership and their rights of egress, entrance, and exit, in other words, these are 2 things, cannot be compromised. So the common areas, in many cases and many buildings in our city, are actually owned by the developer. And so you can technically, stop your entry into that corridor, whereas you may own the inside, but you can't go get to it. So these things have to be corrected.
Yeah, they should be the law.
I mean, we need to correct them by
yeah,
law.
by law. I
In
agree.
order to
And so
protect the
also-
interests of the individual.
And what other laws can we look into to balance out the attraction of the plots versus construction, and what kind of laws can we put in place which do not dampen the enthusiasm of the real estate industry, but at the same time propagate construction and make it just as lucrative. So do you think by implementing these laws, we can manage that?
Oh, this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning.
So
when we are looking at these two core issues, I'm talking now in the context of Punjab, and each area has its own distinct differentials. What you have here, you have a very interesting situation here. 100 million people in Punjab, yet our housing policies are contra development. So we need to correct this. These anomalies we need to fix. Then we move on from there onwards. What other incentives we need to provide?
So basically, who's going to bail the cat is my question.
Well, people like us who are on this forum, and we raise these issues all the time.
Yes,
and it's taken me a number of years to actually highlight the problem, the core problem. Like I was explaining to you right now, that if we can address these two core issues, we are beginning to give and provide the owner of an apartment or a shop or an office building, the tenure that should come to him by virtue of his rights. That's a fundamental right. He's bought that place, but there are anomalies on the law on what he can do with it.
So we're mitigating the risk in terms of ownership and in terms of future growth vis-a-vis mortgaging and vis-a-vis your...
the mortgage bhi wahi aa jati hai na, okay, now. Mortgage is interlinked.
Yeah.
If the bank knows that you own an apartment, but you can't get inside that apartment, right? They'll say, yeah, this is a questionable ownership. So the banks are again, unless we show them the sales deed and we show them how the deed is structured, common areas ki kya hai. So that is a very complex issue. So we need to simplify all this and make it so simple that an average man on the street wants to buy a one-bedroom apartment from whatever building, he will be able to do so without hiring a lawyer to go through all the documentation.
Exactly.
Well, I agree with all of that. Very valid points and should definitely be made laws rather than not. But one of the things...
You've got an escrow account which is parked separately for its maintenance and perpetuity. So in other words, if you have the developer gets 95%, there's 5% which is parked outside. And that park that turns into an endowment. And there are 10 different ways to skin the cat. I mean, Malaysia does this, Singapore does this.
Right.
That you have a part of that which is converted into endowment. And that endowment is then used to run and maintain that rent. Because the developer may die. I mean, what happens if the man dies? Or is his offspring going to look after the place? So you've got to protect everybody's interest, particularly the buyer's interest. So
great. Anyways, we're running out of time. Thank you so much, PQ, for jumping in and further enlightening us with the current status of our laws vis-a-vis real estate. And I think basically, just to wrap it up, we need to somehow bail the cat, bring in the policymakers on board. So that's it. So next time, maybe we should have some policymakers on board for a talk like this. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Take a bow, PQ.